One of the most important things for designers to think about is that any particular grid structure can be used in a lot of different ways. The grid is just a set of guides, not the design of the content. How that content moves on the surface of that grid can happen in a lot of very, very different ways. And you can fill columns with content, images and text all the way out to the margins, and that creates one particular kind of feeling.
What's up, branding experts? Arek here at Ebaqdesign, and my guest today is Timothy Samara. And Timothy is a New York-based graphic designer and educator whose 25-year career has focused on visual identity and branding, communication design, and typography. So working for large corporations, non-profit organizations, and startups. Timothy also teaches at design schools and universities around New York City, including the New School for Design, New York University, NYU, School of Visual Arts, SVA, and many more. He has also written several books on design, and one of them is Making and Breaking the Grid, which is this book. This is the second edition, and this is the book we are going to talk about today. So Timothy is an expert when it comes to graphic design, and that's why I really wanted to have him on our podcast to talk about graphic design layout. Hello, Timothy. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on our podcast.
Thank you, Arek. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So first, I think it's vital to start by talking about the structure in graphic design in general, right? So on one hand, we have designers who see typographic grid as an organizing principle and as a part of their process that helps them, yield precision, order, and clarity in everything they do. And on the other hand, we have some designers who might see grid as a symbol of, aesthetic oppression and something that hinders their expression, basically. But I believe that we need to learn how to use the grid in order to be able to break it when we need to, right? So, and I really like what you said in the book, quote, "The grid system is an aid, not a guarantee. It permits a number of possible uses, and each designer can look for a solution that is appropriate to his or her personal style." So with that, we're going to talk about some of those solutions and how to make a layout and how to use grid to lay out the content. But first, can you talk to us about some of the benefits of making a grid and where it comes from, some of the history?
Sure. So the grid is it's a principle for organizing information. It comes out of, in a very, very organic way, out of the structure of the Latin typeface, letter forms in particular, and also in the way that we structure language, which tends to work in a kind of a horizontal, vertical framework. So it has this very, very kind of organic, natural quality related to the way that Westerners read and expect to navigate information from a structural perspective. The benefits of it, like any kind of a system, it is part of kind of design systems thinking. It allows a designer to create a kind of a continuity of logic, of organizing principles or organizing qualities for graphic material, text and images. That helps hold everything together in a kind of a unified totality so that all the parts of a project, as they vary, sometimes with a little bit of information, sometimes with a lot of information, sometimes different kinds of information in different combinations, can all appear to be speaking with the same voice, conveying the same idea, and leading a reader or a user through the information in a kind of consistent way so that the user becomes familiar with and comfortable with the way that they're interacting with the information. A system is always about this tension between consistency and variation. And what the grid does is allows, of course, for that consistency because all of the elements that it contains or that it governs are following kind of proportions that are divided by a regular set of intervals, guidelines, or breaks in the space of a page or screen from left to right and top to bottom. So all the proportions of elements and the way that they might be organized conform to those divisions in the page space. At the same time, because those spaces can be combined in different sizes or different proportions, it allows for flexibility. That is, as information changes from part to part to part, whether it's from one screen to another in a website, or it's page spread after page spread within a book, or even in a more extensive responsive program where there are many formats, like in a branding system, it allows the designer to be able to create visual cohesion among very, very different kinds of information in different combinations. And that's the primary benefit. If you're thinking in terms of kind of teamwork, the grid also provides a way for several designers in a team or who are working on a project collaboratively to develop individual components independently and still be adhering to some rules so that everybody's work looks like it goes together. And then last, it's a machine for efficiency. Most of the planning and development of the grid structure and what it's going to do, the way that it is going to organize information takes place up front. So there's a kind of a front loading that you spend really more time kind of assessing what the content is and how the grid structure is going to accommodate it and account for, different kinds of situations. And then once those rules are defined, is that in essence, you can bang out a lot of material very, very quickly because those rules have already been established and you're essentially following your own rules, time after time after time. So it reduces the need to kind of design each kind of component, each page spread or each screen kind of from the ground up. So it really improves, kind of the efficiency of workflow. And that's a very, very practical kind of benefit.
So some of my also just to sum up for our listeners, some of the key takeaways from your book is that graphic design is problem solving. So we need to organize all this information: pictures, symbols, fields of text, headlines, and so on. So grid brings systematic order to our layout. So it allows us to easily navigate and ensure visual cohesion and harmony, as you also mentioned. So it makes our work more efficient, right?
Yes.
It allows us to save time down the road. Mm-hmm. So basically, grid is a set of alignment-based relationships that serve as a guide for placing elements on a page, right? Mm-hmm. Their height, the width, height to width proportions. So can we talk about some of the grid basics and fundamentals of page layouts? Things like you mentioned in your book, the column grid, the modular grid, different kind of grids, hierarchic grid, compound grids, image behavior, text behavior, and so on. Can we just touch on some of those key elements to help our listeners understand the concept of building a graphic design layout?
I think the first and most important thing to understand is that one, you make your grid based on whatever the content is, or in response to the content and also in response to the format, whether it's print or screen based, and how the user is going to use it is how they're going to access that content. So any number of any one of a different kind of grid could be potentially useful or appropriate depending on what the content happens to be. If the content is relatively simple, that is, it doesn't have that many different kinds of parts, a simpler grid is more useful. So that it minimizes the potential for complication to kind of creep in over time. That is, if you don't have very, very complicated information, you don't need a very complex grid structure. So in that case, something like for example, if you only had essentially a long form kind of running text, and maybe there were some notations or a very, very minimal number of images, and maybe only captions for those images, and you don't really have to be able to break apart the page space in a dramatic number of ways, because you don't have to separate things, you don't have to group things, you don't have to be able to distinguish between, kind of several different kinds of stuff in the space. And so something as simple as a manuscript grid where you have, in essence, one single block and defined by margins of specific portions might be okay. That might also not be enough. It may, whether that's a functional issue, that is that you need greater distinction, you need to be able to separate at least out, say, the captions from where the running text is, or a call out or something. But that may also be an aesthetic choice, sort of how actively you want to be able to break the page. And so you might say, a column grid of maybe only 2 columns might be useful. Whether those 2 columns happen to be the same width within the page format
Now, we are going to take a quick break here, but we'll be right back. Listen, my mission is to help people build and design iconic brands. So whether you're a business leader who wants to become more intentional with branding and all of its aspects, or you're a creative professional who wants to attract powerful clients and truly be able to help them with branding, then you need to start with a discovery session in order to develop a strategy that will inform all your creative work. And everything that you need in order to learn how to do that, you can find in my online courses at ebaqdesign.com/show, where I share with you my worksheets, case studies, video tutorials, and other additional resources to help you feel safe and strong about your process. Now let's get back to our interview. Show what you are talking about to our listeners.
Right.
So I recommend all you guys to check out the book. The book is quite big. And Timothy illustrates really a lot of different, variations of grid system, gives us examples and different tools and techniques. So, sorry to interrupt you. Go on.
Mm-hmm. So, whether or not the columns, whether there's 2 or 3, happen to be the same size, that is the same width left to right, and the page space is, there's another kind of a decision to make. It could be that the columns are all the same width, and that just by adjusting material from left to right, let's say it's a 2-column grid, from one column to the other, or from using both columns simultaneously, or using one column for one kind of content and another column for another kind of content, could be fine. It could be that, going back to this example of primarily a long form, like an article, where there might just be sort of captions or small insets or notations. You could have a narrow column for that kind of secondary material and focus attention on a much wider column of a different measurement on the same page, in which case then you would be dealing with what's called a hierarchic grid, where each column is given a proportion based on kind of what content is going to occupy it. And so those two columns don't necessarily have to be the same. If you're dealing with material that is very, very complex, wherein you might have 3 or 4 different kinds of text, as well as images of different kinds, as well as something like a sidebar or a timeline or diagrams, infographics, and so on, where all of those different kinds of information are going to appear together, sometimes all at once and sometimes in different combinations, the more kind of complex grid you're going to need. And that would generally tend to suggest a modular grid. That is one where a modular grid in which there are not only columns left to right, but also divisions top to bottom, that is rows.
Yes.
And that gives you then a tremendously larger number of kinds of divisions, and therefore also a greater variety in the kinds of proportions and shapes that can be integrated into that grid structure. And that allows you then to, create very, very specific kinds of treatment for the typography of running text versus headlines versus captions, call-outs, diagram, labeling, infographics, as well as for different kinds of sizes and positions of other kinds of graphic material, images and iconography and tables or charts and so on. I think that being kind of focused on typography as I am, and always being conscious of the reader's experience, especially for not only complex text, but long form text, that is where you're reading extensively, an article or an essay of several thousand words, is that the comfortable quality of that reading experience and the ease of using it, that text becomes very, very important. So very often I'm very concerned about what the typesetting qualities or the attributes of the text happen to be, looking at kind of the width of a block of text or a column, how many characters are on a line, what is the rag shape doing, what's the internal spacing doing, and then really basing the kind of the grid structure on, how readable and legible and comfortable is the text to read, as the starting point for what the grid structure might happen to be. So if I determine, that because the point size is 9 or 9.5, and I need 11.5 points of leading in between the lines, and I want somewhere between 55 and 75 characters on a line for kind of good sequencing and so on. I want the rag shapes to be nice, is that I'll come to some conclusion, depending on what the font is and the size that I pick, that, okay, I've got a column that feels really comfortable, is really easy to read, and it's about it's that wide, maybe it's 2.5 or 3 inches wide or so. And then to look at, well, how many of those can I fit side by side on a page? How many do I need to fit side by side on a page? How dense is that page going to be? And are there also other kinds of content that are going to have to accompany the text? And then you start kind of sort of massaging the dimensions of the columns, the dimensions of the rows, the spaces between, that is the gutters, and then what impact that has on the margins. And are the margins comfortable? Do they set the content off from the exterior of the page and allow for the viewer to kind of separate themselves from the outer world and kind of focus inward on the content itself?
Yeah, that's right. So I just wanted to sum up. So basically, in its simplest form, grid is based on type, as you mentioned, right? And type is also based on vertical and horizontal lines, right? Mm-hmm. So we stack, horizontal sentences below each other, and that creates vertical lines, and so we can group things together. We can use white space to add some dynamism and flow to that, and we can change the weight and the scale to introduce hierarchy of elements and things mm-hmm. like that. So as you already mentioned, every design problem is different and requires different approach, and there are different the variety of options we can go with. So as you mentioned, the first step for us as a designer, it would be to understand the content really, right, and assess the informational characteristics. So because we need to anticipate potential problems with laying out the content, right? Like, do we have long headlines? Do we mm-hmm. need to crop images in certain ways? Mm-hmm. Do we have some requirements regarding page count and so on? Because once we develop the grid as a closed system, right? We should first understand the content and try to design a few pages. And I know in the book you talk about, you really recommend doing this by hand, sketching layouts and then scanning those sketches and then building a grid based on that. And then, considering different options to determining, the width of the columns, the gutter, and a number of them, how many of them fit on one page and so on, as you already mentioned. So, and also things to consider would be like typesetting, right? So interline space, letter space, word space, mm-hmm. Relationship between, images and also for you guys who are listening, it's pertaining to both, digital and print as well, because, in responsive, in web design, we use grid as well, right? So, but when it comes to digital design and web design, we should start with the smallest screen, right? With the smallest format, perhaps like a mobile device, and then started from there and then build, and then try to determine how, the content flows between those screens. Am I right here?
Yes. I would always advocate for really thinking about the smartphone, as a kind of, as a sort of the basis for how you might think about column, because this is going to be your worst case scenario. This is the narrowest and the smallest kind of format area that text is going to appear in. And there are much more, I would say, sort of stringent requirements for, how large the point size has to be, or the pixel size of the text has to be, and how much space you need between. And that's going to really kind of drive, sort of how that text fits within this very, very narrow space, which in essence, if the text is legible and has a readable quality, it's likely to fill most of that space. And that's not a bad place to start for determining the column, especially as the format then expands, into, say, desktop browser, where there's going to be a lot more leeway. So I would always, and then you can sort of apply this thinking to print design too, is to always find, the most difficult or challenging sort of situation or aspect of the material that you're working with, and also the format, so that you solve that problem right off the bat, and then you use the way that you solve that problem to, because you can always make something more complex, you can always make something more expressive, and you can always make something less conventional it's very, very difficult to start with a very, very expressive, kind of irregular, unconventional kind of a layout, and then try to mash it down into a smaller space, or to solve a problem that really has a lot of limitations in it. Once you've kind of gone, kind of whole hog, sort of always thinking about, the task at hand and how that material is going to be used. Yes, of course, if you don't need the mobile component, then you don't have to think about it. There are ways to, kind of reverse or sort of retrofit the layout of, a grid-based layout in a desktop browser environment, downward into the phone. In essence, you're thinking, you have to sort of think sequentially left to right, how the material that's on to the right of the page is going to stack underneath elements that are to the left of the page, so that the sequence remains. But yeah, I would always, and I say it in the book too, is, think about the phone format as your column, as a starting point. If you need to subdivide it, if you need to chop it in half in order to create more interest, or because you want to be able to introduce smaller elements, either for contrast or because of what the content needs are, you can always do that. I provide the example of a website, a news website from Spain, that is where the phone's sort of column format is already subdivided now into 4 smaller columns, so that details like navigation, like the hamburger at the top, the headings, and so on, and also other kinds of divisions, side by side images and so on, can fit within that space and look like it works together, carries the same kind of feeling, and has the same kind of overall sort of design quality, or the same kind of language as it does when it's expanded to the full screen size.
Yeah, so you give I really like you show us a lot of different examples, as you mentioned, this web page of some Spanish web page, right? For you guys who want to check out the book, it's full of real life examples, from some of the top design firms. And so you can really get a sense of different variations of, layouts and grids and how we can use them. And also the next thing I think I wanted to talk about is it was about building a grid, right? Mm-hmm. And also corresponding to the parts to how you structured your book. So next thing I wanted to talk about is using a grid, because building a grid is one thing, right? But then we also need to think about, how the material how it will work within the grid. So we need to consider, scale relationship between elements, the rhythm. You point out things like, should we keep it geometric or more organic, and so on, or to what kind of degree we feel that the structure, the grid that we build, and we keep it full to the margins, or we leave some space open and make it more dynamic and more interesting. Some of my takeaways from this part is that should the content on pages be positioned symmetrically, mirroring, or asymmetrically? Should the content be oriented towards the spread's interior, or pushed outward towards the edges or four edges? And then we can also use techniques like transparency to create some depth. Right, like for example, this I think is a common practice nowadays. Overlapping text on top of images. So some part of the text or a headline overlaps the image that is behind it, that creates some kind of a dimension. And basically how we can achieve layout variation by alternatively placing images. We can place images towards the top, towards the bottom, left, or right on different spreads, so that we create like a kind of a rhythm or a sequence, as you describe in the book. So it's not all the same. So it's also more interesting to look at and browse or read the content, right?
Absolutely. I think it's, and you touched on this, I think one of the most important things for designers to think about is that any particular grid structure can be used in a lot of different ways. The grid is just, it's a set of guides. It is not the actual design of the object, whatever it happens to be. It's not the design of the content. How that content moves on the surface of that grid can happen in a lot of very, very different ways. And you can fill columns with content, with images and text all the way out to the margins, and that creates one particular kind of feeling. You can push the content down or compress it into a low area within the page. You can raise it up. You can compress it left or right, and so on. Things can move in a very kind of up and down sort of rhythmic way, and they can also create very kind of static block. I think that the idea of what that compositional language is and the way that material moves in the space is itself kind of part of the message of the content. It provides support for the feeling of the content, and so those are decisions the designer has to make really carefully. In addition to the font selection, which is the fonts that you choose, which are also going to kind of convey certain kinds of feelings or attitudes, is that structure and movement. A composition itself is a kind of an idea, and like I said, any grid, whether it's 6 columns wide or 8 columns wide, and however many rows deep, is that's the thing that kind of holds everything together and provides kind of proportional harmony. But the designer still has to kind of invent the idea for how the material is happening on that on that surface. A grid can be used in a very, very organic and almost fluid kind of a way, where it almost seems to disappear. And in fact, there's a kind of a way of thinking is that you want the reader or the user, the viewer, to feel that geometry and to feel that there is this kind of cohesion between things, but you don't want to beat them over the head with it. Where the grid is absolutely present is that you want, all the time, and especially not kind of monotonously repetitive where everything is in the same place. And this goes back to the kind of the fundamental issue of using this kind of structure as a system, is that a system is about this balancing act, this tension between consistency and conformity, that you understand how everything goes together in similar ways, but also it's about variation. If you don't have the variation, is that you create a very, very dull and repetitive and monotonous experience. Sometimes that's desirable, not necessarily dull, but of course you don't ever want anything to be dull. But sometimes the nature of certain kinds of information, things like instructions, manuals, that sort of thing, sort of ask the designer to get out of the way. And to present the information in as systematic and consistent a way as possible, so that the reader becomes really, familiar with, learns rapidly how the information is being presented and how to order it in their own minds. And sometimes that makes a lot of sense. And other times, you want there to be a lot of variation, where there are a lot of different kinds of rules at play, and each of those rules allows for individual kinds of variations. There's no right or wrong way to go about that. All of these kinds of decisions are part of the design process, the part of the sort of conceiving of, and how that information, how that material is going to be presented, and what kind of effect it's going to have on the end user, on the reader, both conceptually and emotionally and visually at the same time. And all those things are intertwined. So all the decisions that a designer makes have to come out of what the content is. And that, sometimes the content tells you, it's a grid is not useful here. It's not going to, it might be generally kind of useful in the way that, a chair that has 4 legs and a seat allows you to sit on it. But sometimes that chair can be made out of some kind of puffy, rubbery material, and sometimes it can be made out of steel slats. And those are 2 very, very different kinds of feeling. Sometimes the chair might not even have to have legs to sit on it. And then, so it's kind of a weird analogy, but, the way that something functions is also, has to do with, what is the kind of the idea that you're conveying. And sometimes the grid is not appropriate.
So let's talk about those instances when we can break the grid, or we can, because as you mentioned, and as I started this episode with, saying that, for example, I specialize in identity design just like you, and we need to kind of build some kind of guidelines and some kind of a structure to bring cohesion and consistency between different elements and different applications, right? But other designers might be concerned that it kind of like hinders their creativity in some way, or expression. So, and now you mentioned that, dictate what we can or cannot do, basically. So no, so the last part in your book is also, you talk about breaking the grid. So so as you already mentioned, so for some instances we might want to ignore the structure altogether, or create some specific kind of some kind of alternative structures to create some kind of emotional reaction from the viewer, from the user, or invoke like some kind of narrative association or things like that. So, so here you talk about deconstructing the grid to generate new spatial relationships, right? And you give us and you show us specific examples as well. So the techniques we can use here, some of my takeaways from the book is like splitting, splicing, shifting elements, deformation, distortion, right? Using centered axis structure. And you also give us like whole bunch of other types of geometric structure, like stepping, clustering, rotational, radial, concentric, spiraling, and so on. So can you just touch base on that and walk us through some of those strategies for breaking the grid?
I think that the reasons one might not use a grid are the ones that you mentioned, is that you're looking for an experience that is not, or to generate an experience that is not so regimented and so ordered that it is a much more kind of a narrative and expressive, we could say artistic, if you want to use that phrase, kind of idea. I think that for the most part, the kinds of projects that really demand a grid are those where a system is really important, and especially when the system is very, very complex. Because part of that, the designing of that thing has to do with how do you kind of corral all that stuff in a way that's going to make sense, a lot, over and over and over again. But a lot of projects that are, kind of one-offs, like a poster or just a book cover or a very, very simple or short kind of brochureware website, or a printed brochure where there's not a whole lot of content, where that content is not all that complicated. Those sort of lend themselves to other kinds of approach, and there are many. When we talk about structure, we're not just, a grid is not the only kind of structure that exists. Every kind of composition, no matter how organic it is, presents us with a structure. And so that structure, whether it's something that seems kind of irregular or something that might kind of evoke the natural world, the flow of lava down the side of a mountain, something that's very, very fluid, or something that's kind of networked or kind of spiraling or concentric. Those are also structures, and that really kind of depends, I think, on what it is that you're trying to convey, because those kinds of structures tend to take on a more kind of pictorial kind of a quality. So we start to say, okay, what does this structure look like, rather than seeing a bunch of columns and a bunch of rows, sort of geometric breaking of space, and saying, okay, this is an informational structure. But we may start to look at something that is kind of branched, as being kind of, oh, that reminds me of a tree, or this reminds me of the way a river flows through a landscape, or the way that bugs look or something. I think that in looking at how the structure of a layout, how elements are arranged in space, in itself, can give rise to kind of meaningful ideas that can support whatever the actual content is. There are so many ways to think about the arrangement of material in space. And I think a lot of people, get kind of hung up on going to the grid, almost as a convention. And like I said, very often it makes a lot of sense. But there are other ways to provide a clear experience and to to allow somebody to navigate through information that doesn't necessarily have to be based on vertical horizontal alignment structure. I think it's worth always investigating whether or not there are ways of presenting information that don't necessarily adhere to what everybody thinks is right or the usual way of doing things. I'm not the kind of person that some designers also think about the grid in a kind of an ideological way, that it is part of the philosophy that they have about how design works, about how information should be presented, about how things even aesthetically ought to look from a stylistic standpoint. And that's totally fine. I'm not one of those people. Whatever tool, whatever method is the best one or the right one or the most compelling one, and the one that achieves the communication goals in the best way possible, is the tool or the method that you should use.
For some of you guys who want to see something, here are some examples of some conventional, layout or grid. Right here.
That's an interesting example that you bring up, in that itself is a system. Is that there are, but it is and it is relatively column based. So there is some deconstruction involved.
There is some distortion, right?
Yeah, there's distortion and also deconstruction, but it is essentially based on a set of columns. But then there are things that can happen.
We can see all those applications that this is
right, especially consistent. If you go to the other page, that long, narrow fold-out.
This one?
Brochure, right? So that's a folded brochure. So it folds in on itself. You can recognize. I think everybody can see that there are columns, and those columns are based on a very, very tight grid. That is, that there's a lot of columns in there. Those columns are able to be proportioned given different widths by combining them, so that the content can be, using 3 columns or only 2 columns or 4 columns and so on. The perspective is a distortion, and it happens in a specific measurement. That is, that one side of a column of text is enlarged in perspective a certain number of rows upward compared to the left hand or the right hand side. The text can be, another rule in the system is the text in the column can reverse from flush left to flush right. And that the columns themselves, as happens in some other places, can actually rotate. That the column can be actually rotated among the increments in the grid structure. So even though it comes off looking like it is kind of entirely I wouldn't say random, but it is very, very irregular, organic, and so on, is that because it's a system, is that there had to be some rules in the way that things worked so that other designers could carry out additional communications, other projects down the road, and have it all look like it goes together, like the same designers are designing it. But it's an interesting tension between, something that is, in theory it is breaking the grid a lot, but at the same time it's also very, very systematic in the way that those things happen. And that's one way of thinking about it. And then you can have a system that is really organic, where there is no where it almost starts to come apart.
Would that be a good example?
This is another interesting example, because this is also structured on a grid.
It is also structured.
Actually, it's not really a grid. That's I misspoke. Excuse me. There are rules for how those shapes, the shapes of those text blocks are made, but they're very, very loose. But there's a consistency in the way that those shapes appear, is that they're essentially always trapezoids. The trapezoids are always a certain kind of a dimension or a space away from each other, and that there are specific rules for how the text changes from light to medium to bold, from block to block to block, in order to establish a hierarchy. So again, there's always this kind of balancing out as the system becomes, or as the visual expression becomes more irregular or wilder on one hand, then something else has to kind of offset that to bring a kind of a measure of control back, so it doesn't just kind of fall apart and your reader is like wondering what the hell is going on,
Right.
because you don't ever want to create confusion. That's never desirable.
Right.
Although, somebody might argue and say, well, confusion is itself a kind of a message, and sometimes confusing the reader, somewhat is helpful. There's an idea there. How do you confuse someone, but then also bring them out of that confusion, so they come away with a kind of a clear understanding of what's happening?
You've talked about the different grid systems and how to use them, how to build the grid and how to break the grid. As we are approaching the end of our interview, can you let us know, just for designers who want to learn more from you? Of course, I'm gonna leave a link in the description box to this book. Is there any other way you want designers to find more about you or the work you do? Maybe other professors and teachers who wanna collaborate with you, or clients who wanna work with you. How can we get in touch with you?
I've been working on my website for some time. I had one previously, and it got. It's a long story. So that website should be up in the very near future. It will be timothysamara.com. You can put my email address in there. I think that's fine. You can also find me at creativelive.com. A couple of live webinars about kind of design fundamentals, and Creative Live and I are working together now to develop some more courses for their platforms. That's useful. And if you visit my publisher's website and my particular page, I have a couple of other books that might be useful, in particular design elements. The third edition of that just came out.
How many? You have like 9 books, I think, right?
I think it's either 9 or 10. I've kind of lost track. And a couple of editions each. The latest, if you want to plug, is this one, which is Design Elements. This is the 3rd edition, which has just been.
Seen that. It was just released, right?
Just released, and I'm not actually sure that it's available on Quarto's website yet, on my publisher's website, but it should be available, I think, soon. And
that could be quite interesting, I think, especially for brand identity designers, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it deals with sort of every aspect: form and space, color theory, typography, layout, and then also and image making, and really kind of both the sort of visual and conceptual, kind of meaningful aspects of all those sort of major areas of design. But it deals a lot with systems, especially in the last chapter. So it's a good kind of a kind of an overview of the whole kind of kit and caboodle of everything that we do as designers.
Awesome. Yeah, because you have books that go specifically, like, for example, you have books about typography, you have books about layout, and now you have a book about design system, right? That was the title of this book, right?
The design element. So it's everything. Systems is in there, but it kind of brings everything together into one.
Yeah, you mentioned color also as well, and different about visual language, right? In general. Mm-hmm. Awesome. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us on our podcast, and I'm gonna please give me some time for post-production. I'm gonna let you know when it goes live, and of course I'm gonna link to your book. And do you know exactly when the new book is going to be available?
I don't actually. I had looked for it a couple of weeks ago at my publisher's website, and I only just received the advanced copies. So usually it's about a month after that it starts becoming available. I'll go look again, and I can let you know.
So even if it goes live, you can always shoot me an email.
And I think it might be up on the site, and if it is, it might be available for pre-order.
Awesome. Okay, so we can link to that as well, right?
Yeah, I can give you the URL for that.
Sure. Awesome. Okay, so thanks again.
It is my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
I really appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Bye. So thanks for tuning in. And if you've enjoyed this episode of On Branding Podcast, follow me on social media for more tips on branding, strategy, and design. This was Arek Dvornechuck from Ebaqdesign, and I will see you in the next one.